and what my company does, where we're heading, what we plan to do, what we're doing today, what we want to do tomorrow, and as I said, what I've learned along the way. And then I want to make sure that we leave time for Q&A in case people in the audience have questions. And I'll say, as a housekeeping announcement, I believe what you should do if you have a question, in order to try and keep everybody organized, is that I think the plan is for you to use the chat function and type up any questions that you have. And then Ushta and Yazdi will consolidate those questions. And then I will try and answer them at the end of the presentation. So as I go, if you have questions, just type them out and hit send, and we will get to them. So thank you again. I grew up in Boston, Massachusetts. My dad is a Parsi member of WZCC originally from Mumbai, Bombay, India. My mom is originally from Lahti in Finland. And so I'm a first generation American, like many people on the call, either they moved to the US or other countries, from India, to give their kids a better life or better opportunities, and to, take advantage of all the opportunities of America. That's certainly the environment that I grew up in. My dad is a Parsi. We grew up going to Zagba events, but we also went to a Hindu Vedanta church every Sunday. And so, I got a mixture of understanding different faiths. My mom was raised as a Lutheran, and is still technically a member of the Lutheran Church of Finland, although I don't think she practices that much anymore. But, I learned a lot about how all the different religions really are seeking the same thing, and we're all trying to get to enlightenment. And one of the tenets of Vedanta is that there's one truth, many paths, and one God with many names. And so, I always grew up learning to and thinking about bringing in different aspects of something that might seem very different, but actually has a very similar common goal, and looking at how diversity or differences can end up bringing strength to any situation. Growing up, my dad started his own company when I was 4 out of the first floor of our house. So I had parents who worked extremely hard. I was around very entrepreneurial environments. My dad was working 7 days a week. My mom used to teach night classes. They were certainly very driven in their own work, and they instilled that drive in my brother and me. So, they gave us all of the things that, parents would want to give their children. They gave us great educations. They made sure that we, academically excelled and got into good colleges, and supported, our extracurricular interests and activities, whether for me that was music and athletics on the rowing team. And so I got to college at age 18, with all of this stuff and this idea that, I can do whatever I want to do, and feeling very empowered and having had a very privileged life. But I didn't really know what direction I wanted to go in. I knew that people who are smart become doctors and lawyers, but I didn't think that either one of those was what I wanted to do. And I really struggled, I struggled to think about what I wanted to major in. And even once I picked a major, I struggled to think about what I wanted to actually do as a job after college. And my college career really had been a lot about rowing. I was a coxswain on the rowing team, and that was really what I cared about the most, more than academics, even though I was still making great grades, but that just wasn't what I cared about. So I defaulted into finance. It was something that it looked like, made a lot of money. I had a lot of friends who were going into finance, and I thought, if they can do it, I can do it too. It seemed like a great place where I would get an education. The company I worked for, BlackRock, made a lot of investments in its analysts in terms of training us in Excel, training us in PowerPoint, training us on how to present to people and give meetings. So I said, okay, sure, I'll do that. But I couldn't really see myself in that same company, in 5 years. And I started to look around and sort of see where I was and what I was doing. And I felt like somehow it's just not right. I don't want to be I was living in New Jersey, which was great, but I wanted something more. I wanted something different. I wanted to feel like I was helping people somehow. And so I applied for a bunch of different jobs at age 24. One of them was to the Clinton Health Access Initiative. Another one was to Bain Consulting Group. I was also considering going back to grad school for environmental science. So I was kind of all over the map. I still didn't really know what I wanted to do. I just knew that it wasn't asset management probably. And so when I got this job offer at the Clinton Health Access Initiative, they told me, is there anywhere you wouldn't go? And I said, no, you can send me anywhere. And they said, great. We're sending you to Nigeria. And I said, where's Nigeria? So I would like to give you guys a quick poll to see how much the audience knows about Nigeria, because I really knew next to nothing about it when I moved there in 2008. So Yazdi, I don't know if you can set up the poll, but you can see on my screen, there are 4 options for which country Nigeria might be. Please take a guess. If you don't cheat, don't look at Google. I'd also like you to guess, what is the population of Nigeria is the second question. And then, what percentage, this is a comparison between Nigeria and India, because many of us have roots or are still living in India. Just a kind of comparison, what's the difference between the poverty level in India and Nigeria? So I want to just gauge the audience and see how much you know. So while you're doing that, I'll say that, I spent, as Ushta said, I spent 4 years living in Nigeria, 2 years working only in the Nigerian Ministry of Health and with the Nigerian Ministry of Health, and 2 years working all over the continent. And I just started to, again, take a look around me and think about and realize, okay, what do I care about what I'm doing right now? And I realized I liked the fact that I felt like I was helping people, I was having more of an impact. But when I would go to these health clinics, I would look around and see a lot of challenges, a lot of really poor, mostly mothers and children, queuing up for these free drugs. And the drugs were free, but often the testing wasn't free, or the transport to the hospital wasn't free. And there were still these barriers, and there were still these challenges that a lot of really poor people were facing, that was making it very hard to live a good life and to have a life with dignity and a life with options. And I realized that a lot of the underlying reason that a lot of the women in these health clinics seemed to lack options was because they lacked agency and they lacked money to be able to make decisions. And so, I started to think to myself, I want to do something that undercuts the underlying problem of poverty. I want to try and figure out, what I can do to solve that problem. And, the more I thought about it, the more I saw unemployment in Nigeria is over 40%. And everybody who has a job typically is supporting not only their immediate family, but often extended families. And even my own employees, they'll often be paying school fees for their siblings or their nieces and nephews. There's a huge amount of dependency in Nigerian culture that comes from having a job. And so I sort of over 4 years started to realize all these things. The nonprofit I was working for, the Clinton Health Access Initiative, was getting a lot of money from various donors. Those donors were changing their mind about whether they cared about HIV or malaria or vaccines or diarrhea in children. And I just felt like I wanted to be able to do one thing and focus on it. So I decided, I think I want to start my own company, but I didn't know how to do that. So let's take a break from my story. I'll tell you the answer to the polls. It looks like we've only gotten 37 people to vote. Yazdi, should we give them a few more minutes to vote? We'll give you guys a few more minutes.
Let's wait for a couple of minutes.
Okay, perfect. So I'll keep going and you guys can keep guessing on this. But so, I didn't know how to start a business. I had worked for 2 years in a marketing role, and then I had worked for 4 years at a nonprofit. So I went back to business school. I went to Harvard Business School in large part because it's a top tier school, and I knew that I would have access to a really strong network of people who might be able to help me on the flip side of that experience. So, I went to business school. again, I was looking around trying to figure out, is this what I want to do? Do I actually just want to work in New York and do something else? Did I get my living in Nigeria out of my system? Or is this something that I actually really want to do? And it turned out that it was something I really wanted to do. So in my second year of business school, I started trying to put together this business idea. So what is the business idea? Well, let me explain it to you. Tomato Jos is a for-profit social enterprise. What is a social enterprise? A social enterprise
Shall
is
we just look at the polls, please?
Yeah, let's
see.
Here, let's see how people did. Okay, so the correct answer was B. This I call Nigeria the armpit of Africa because it's that's where it's positioned. Nigeria's population, actually, yes, D is the correct answer. It's 200 million people. For the second poll, I might have given you the wrong answer there. But so Nigeria actually is the most populous country in Africa with 200 million people. And of that 200 million people, 50% of them are age 18 or below. So it's an extremely young population, an extremely big population. If you look at the next question, the question about what percent of Indians live in extreme poverty, the correct answer, Yazdi, is actually A, 5%. Only 5%.
Yeah, it is showing what people.
Oh, it's showing what the most people.
Yeah.
I see. Okay. So you guys got Nigeria right, but you got the population of Nigeria wrong. It's really big, and India is actually done way better in poverty reduction than a lot of you think. Only 5% of Indians live in extreme poverty today. However, Nigeria, the correct answer is 44% of Nigerians live in extreme poverty. That makes Nigeria actually the country with the largest number of extremely poor people in the world, more than India. So Nigeria has a larger number of extremely poor people than any other country. And so for me, learning that, I had come from India, I had gone to India, many times as a child, and had seen what I thought was pretty poor circumstances. But when I moved to Nigeria in 2008, I realized that actually what I see in India is not nearly as bad and as dire as the circumstances in Nigeria. And even when I go back to visit my family, I went back over Christmas this past year. I went back a couple of years prior to that. Even going to the village and seeing, agricultural villages outside of Hyderabad, where my great aunt lives, I can still see that there's way more wealth in these villages than in the villages that I'm working in Nigeria, just in terms of the education, in terms of the access that people have to electricity, running water, etc. So it's a country that has a huge challenge and a huge opportunity, and I felt like I could make a big impact, working in the country where the largest number of poor people in the world live. Moreover, Nigeria has a huge disparity in wealth. So along the coastal areas, which is where the oil is, in Lagos, Port Harcourt, you find much more wealth. But if you go to the northern part of Nigeria, where my company is located, that's really where the poverty lies. The poverty rates are 70%, 65%, much, much higher in the north than they are in the south. So that spurred me to start Tomato Jos. So what is Tomato Jos? Well, Tomato Jos is a for-profit social enterprise. What does that mean? A social enterprise, to me, is a company that works simultaneously to drive its own bottom line and the bottom line of the constituents in the community in which it resides. So for us, we are a farming and processing company. The word Jos is actually a Nigerian city. It's a city that's known for agricultural production. We're not in Jos, we're about 3 hours away. But the term Tomato Jos is a Nigerian phrase that we used for marketing purposes. We grow tomatoes, and we help and support small farmers to grow tomatoes as well. And our bottom line is linked to their bottom line, because the more successful they are, the more tomatoes we can purchase for our factory. And so how we make money is by buying tomatoes from our farm and from the outgrowers, and then processing those tomatoes into tomato paste, turning that into a retail product, and then selling it in the market. Because Nigeria is such a large country with 200 million people, the market for tomato paste is quite large as well. Every year, Nigerians consume $500 million worth of tomato paste, and they consume it in two different products mainly, or two different recipes. The first is called jollof rice, which is a spicy tomato-based rice that's consumed by most Nigerians at least a couple times a week. And the second is red stew, which is a tomato-based stew, which is used and eaten with white rice. And it has tomato, onion, hot pepper, ginger, curry, thyme, and a few other spices. And that's also a very, very common dish. So these two dishes really are key and central to Nigerian cuisine. They both require tomatoes and tomato paste, but Nigeria imports 1/3 of its food, and they import 100% of their tomato paste. So even though there are many tomato farmers all over the country, especially in the northern part of the country, somehow those tomatoes are not turning into a value-add product. And so when I first tried to look at this problem, I was trying to think about, why is that the case? What's going on? And what I realized was that in most parts of the world where tomato paste is made, the farmers are way more productive. They are able to grow at a much higher yield per hectare and a much lower cost per ton than what Nigerian farmers are able to do. I was very fortunate at Harvard to have the ability to make connections with a number of different players in the tomato paste industry. And so when I was doing research for this company, I flew to California and I asked a bunch of tomato processors out there, how to get started and what I should do and what I should think about. And across the board, every single person told me, Mira, you need to be a farmer first. If you cannot grow tomatoes at the right cost and at the right quality for the right period of time, it doesn't make sense to put a factory up. And the factory is really, really expensive, and you will fail. So I said, okay, no problem. We'll start by farming. So from 2014 to 2020, we've learned how to farm tomatoes successfully as a commercial grower, and we've also learned how to teach smallholder farmers how to be commercial growers and how to be successful. So how did we do that? Well, there's no rocket science to increasing yields. And to give you a small idea about what we're dealing with, the average yield in tomato farmers in Nigeria is 5 tons per hectare. The global average yield is 35 tons per hectare. So Nigerians are really, really, really unproductive at growing. And there's a variety of reasons why. They're using bad seed, they're not using enough fertilizer, they're not doing great field prep, they don't weed their fields effectively, they don't use the fertilizer effectively. The more we counted, we realized there were over 100 different behaviors in the farmers that we were trying to change. And that's a lot of change. And we all know that change is very hard, especially if you've been doing something one way for 20 or 30 years. So we tried to think about what's the best way to give the small farmers that we're working with, many of whom have little to no formal education, an environment where they will succeed. And so we developed what we called our model farm. So we have our commercial farm, which is located within our land. And then right next to the commercial farm, still inside our land, we have what we call our model farms, which is our land, but we invite farmers on to farm for us on that land with very, very close supervision. And we give them, at the beginning of the season, they sign a contract. And that contract says, we're going to give you this much fertilizer, this many seeds, this much chemical, this many classroom trainings, this many practical trainings, this many extension visits. All of those things we're valuing at this amount. And we're valuing your tomatoes at this amount So you need to give us this many tomatoes back to pay for all of these things that we've given you. But everything above that, you get to keep as profit. You can sell the tomatoes to us and we will give you cash. And so we have been able to, through that system, help farmers, because a lot of the time, they say you need to spend money to make money. That's the case in farming as well. There's a huge amount of upfront cost of the fertilizer, of the seeds, of the irrigation costs, and all those kinds of things that farmers can't necessarily afford because they don't have that money saved. So we give them this loan. They then can pay back the loan. We work with them very, very closely, and we're able to do that because they're farming inside our land. So it's very easy for us to go in and observe them every single day. And then at the end of the season, they give us the commensurate volume of the output, and then everything above that volume, they get cash. So through this system, we've actually been able to have pretty impressive impact, especially with our women farmers. So if you look here, like I said, our baseline yields in Nigeria are 5 tons per hectare. The farmers in our program are now getting almost 40 tons per hectare, and our best 5 farmers, or our best 10 farmers, got 70 tons per hectare this year. And so they're making much, much more money than they were, before they started working with us. And as one story, so what we do is, after they've worked with us for 2 years on our farm, and we go through 2 tomato cycles and 2 maize cycles. So corn is what's grown in the off season. And we want to give the farmers, there's a lot of similarity between corn and tomato growing, although tomato growing is a little bit more technical, but we want to give the farmers as many chances to grow under our supervision as possible, so that when they graduate from the model farm to become outgrowers, they have the tools that they need. They have the confidence that they know what to do. And so after 2 years in the model farm, our farmers graduate to become outgrowers, and they farm on their own farms. They still get a loan from us, and they still sign a contract to sell to us. But the loan package is slightly different. There are fewer extension visits because their land might be farther away. And so we provide a slightly different service to the outgrowers as the model farmers. But as an example of, a success story, there was a woman in our program who, she first joined in the summer when we were growing corn. And, her husband, we're working in northern Nigeria in a very predominantly Muslim area, which is predominantly very patriarchal in nature. And a lot of women would have to ask their husbands for permission to come to the farm, for permission to join our program. One husband gave his wife permission, but he told her, I don't think you're going to succeed. You're going to default on your loan. This company is going to arrest you, and I'll see you in prison. And, it's pretty hard to hear your own husband tell you that. But she kept on coming to the farm every day. She kept on doing her work. And at harvest time, she asked her husband to come and join her and help her harvest. And he was shocked to find that her corn harvest was about 3 times larger than his corn harvest on his own farm. And after that point, he changed his tune. He started saying, if my wife ever tells me she wants to go to the farm, I always let her go. Because he started to realize that she was actually bringing in value and money and resources into the family. And so, seeing that kind of impact, and seeing that we're getting women to, especially women, to be able to generate their own money, be able to make household decisions, be able to buy their kids' school uniforms or get their houses re-roofed, that's the impact that we've been trying to have. And it's really been great to see that impact in play. So I've been telling you guys this really great, wonderful story, but I feel the need to stop us and take us back for a second. I said that, we're this farming and processing company. We haven't started processing yet. We're actually just a farming company still. It's taken us, when I first started Tomato Jos in 2014, I thought that I would be exiting, and selling to a private equity company within 7 years of when I started the company, right? And we're in year 6 now, and we don't even have a factory yet. So my expectations have not been met. And, there was a lot that I realized, farming takes a long time. You learn something in the first year, And then you have to wait a whole year before you can apply that lesson because it's a seasonal thing. It's not like tech where the iterations can happen immediately. And so it took us 3 years to figure out how to farm commercially at the high yields that we wanted to get. And then it took us another 3 years to figure out how to get smallholder farmers to farm at the yields that we want to get. And not only at the yields, but at the cost. Because remember, the factory only makes sense if the factory can buy tomatoes at the right cost and then make a competitive product. So we are very fortunate that within the last year, we've raised money for the factory. So, I've been singularly focused on getting our yields up, getting our cost of production down, creating a program that works for farmers, that is impactful for farmers, because that is what I would call the baseline foundation on top of which the factory can sit and successfully run. And so where we are today and where we hope to be tomorrow are significantly different. We're in the middle of a huge year of growth. We're planning to increase the land under cultivation by a factor of 5, give or take. We're planning to double the number of farmers in our program. Our goal is to continue increasing our yields. And then we're putting up a whole factory. So we're starting a whole new business unit. And this is really what will drive profitability for our company. We're not making a profit right now. We're not cash flow positive right now. We're a venture-backed company. So we have investors who have put money in that is sustaining the company, but we're not yet sustained by our own revenues. So we've ordered processing equipment from Italy. And as you can probably guess, there have been challenges because of the COVID-19 situation, which affected Italy quite hard. But because food production all over the world is considered essential, our supplier kept on working through the COVID crisis. They're getting ready to ship out the equipment. It should start to ship to Nigeria at the end of next month. And we've also started building the factory in which the equipment will sit, because again, Nigeria is a very poor country, a very fragmented country. I have to put in the well to get the water. There's no municipal water for us. I have to buy generators to run the power for the factory because there's no town electricity that we can just plug into. We're off the grid, and the grid only runs maybe 9 hours a day. So even if I was connected to the grid, it wouldn't provide enough power for my factory. So we're actually now building our own power systems, building our own water systems, building a physical factory, and bringing in all of this equipment to put inside the factory with the goal of commissioning that factory in February of next year, and then launching the product later this year around this time next year. So it's a very exciting time of growth for us. And this has been the goal all along. But in order to get to this point, we had to make sure that we had the raw material part sorted out, and that the social element of the business was fundamentally working well and in place. So I want to talk a little bit about how I've gotten this far. What are some of the main things that I've learned as an entrepreneur? The first is certainly to ask for help and seek help. My background is not in agronomy or in food production or in engineering. My major in college was community health, which is, epidemiology and sociology basically mixed together. So, I learned very early to ask people for help, and be genuine when you're asking for help, explain why you're asking, be specific, be concise, be respectful of other people's time, and be grateful for the support that they give you. And we could never have gotten this far if I hadn't asked at least 1,000, maybe 10,000 questions to so many different people who I knew and so many different people who I didn't know at the time. Like I said, I asked for a lot of help from other people in the tomato processing industry. I've asked for a lot of help and support from friends of mine in Nigeria, everything from how do I make this higher to what division of the ministry of what department do I go to get this permit? I relied very heavily on my former boss from the Clinton Foundation, from the Clinton Health Access Initiative. He was one of my first investors, and he sits on, my advisory committee. And he helped me significantly, just learning how to operate and work in an environment that's very different from the one I grew up in. So certainly not being afraid to say you don't know and asking for help, I think is really important. It's not going to make you worse off, and feeling dumb is a small price to pay. Similarly, know your business. When I first started Tomato Jos, I didn't really fully appreciate how much detail I would need to understand about every single different aspect of my business, how much I would need to understand about what the different types of fertilizer are and why they're important to apply at certain times of the plant's life cycle, how important irrigation is, and what kinds of irrigation is required for what type of plants, learning about soil structure, learning about all these different things. And now as we start processing, I'm learning about steam and, pressure and wastewater management and all of these things that I really, in my head before when I started the company, I didn't somehow think I would need to know that level of detail. But I think that the more you understand what your business does and what the dependencies are on your business, the more you can be strategic and manage risk. But at the same time, the next lesson learned for me was about investing in people. You can't do it all yourself. And you can't clone yourself, nor should you want to clone yourself, because I certainly have weaknesses and blind spots that I'm not even aware of. I used to have a really hard time letting go. Once I understood the details, I wanted to make sure that every single detail was perfect. But that is not conducive for growth. And so I realized investing in people means certainly paying decent wages, paying competitive wages, potentially giving access to equity for your team. It means investing in the people who are giving you money. Making sure that they know what's going on, that they have transparency, and that you're seeking their advice in areas where they can offer it, and that you're telling them, both the good news and the bad news as it happens, so that people aren't surprised. But within my team, it also means understanding that nobody's going to be exactly like me. I need to think about nobody's going to be perfect, right? I took over 4 years to find the person who now is running my finance and operations and back office work. And part of that was because I realized I needed to pay more for that position. But part of that was also that I realized I needed to think through what skill set I really want. How do I then hire for that skill set? How do I test somebody to see if they have that skill set? And then how do I understand what somebody's weaknesses and strengths are and put them in a position where they can really excel and where their strengths can really help the company. And, that means spending a huge amount of time with the people that you're hiring, bringing them on board, understanding what their values are, sharing what your values are, and creating that strong communication, and then starting to let go, which again, as somebody who has started the company from a 2-person or 3-person company to a 50-person company, it can be really hard to let go. But the only way you can grow is, each person is only able to do this much stuff. And so if you are trying to do this much stuff, but you have 50 people underneath you, they all need to be doing this much stuff for the company to be doing this much in total. And so letting go is a big part of that investment process. The next thing I think is staying focused. For me, I had pretty early on a lot of interest from other Nigerian companies, other African entrepreneurs, telling me, oh, I want you to work on growing palm oil in, South Nigeria. I want you to help me set up a greenhouse in Lagos. I want to run a tomato factory in Rwanda. There seemed like a lot of opportunities even today. This past week, the Central Bank of Nigeria came to my farm unannounced and told my guys in charge there, since I'm in the US right now, that they want us to grow enough seedlings, tomato seedlings, for 4,000 hectares of farmland this season, and that they're going to pay for everything up front. And, these opportunities sound great, but you have to ask yourself, is this pulling me away from what I want to do? If I say yes to this, what am I then going to have to say no to? And I think, once you realize what it is you want to do, staying focused on that and making sure that you're trying to build a strategy around that is really important. And you have to learn a lot of the times when and how to say no gracefully, or say, maybe we'll revisit that later because it's not lined up with what our resources are geared towards right now, what our strategy is geared towards right now. And that also, I think, has been helped by the fact that we now have a formal board, that's helping me to make decisions, so that, we can all sort of move together. So related to that, the final point, for me is around sharing what you learn, both within the team, certainly with investors and, other followers of the company. And for me also, I'm trying to, figure out how to, give back or pay forward to other young people who want to get into something like this, and I think it can be really hard and intimidating. And a lot of the times, people don't really know what they want to do. And I think, sharing my story, sharing the fact that I didn't know what I wanted to do. And, it's okay to not know, and it's okay to sort of just try something, and see how it goes. That's really important. For me, as a non-Nigerian in Nigeria, one of the things that has been really inspiring for me is being able to connect with other young Nigerians, either from abroad or who have stayed in Nigeria the whole time, who want to make their country better, and who want to try and make a difference. There's a lot of challenges in the country today. There are a lot of people who are trying to leave, going to Canada, go to the US, go to the UK, go to Australia, go to Dubai, go anywhere outside of the country. And so every time my story can inspire somebody and I can try and give somebody advice on how to, be in this area and make their own impact, that's something that, also brings value and joy to me. So the conclusion I think that I want to share with everybody before we take questions is that, in life, there's a lot of randomness. There's a lot of things that you can't control. There's a lot of things that will happen to you that are unexpected. I think the first thing, and this goes back to, my dad, like I was saying, he is a Parsi and a Zoroastrian, but he's also been a big part of, has done a lot of reading of, various Hindu texts, including the Bhagavad Gita. And I think that, one of the key points that Krishna is trying to make to Arjuna, on the battle line is, you got to just take a step forward. You can't just sit here. The worst thing you can do is nothing. You've got literally 1 million soldiers behind you waiting for you to move, and move forward, do something, and then notice and look around at where you are. And if you don't like where you're going, it can be hard, but you can always change. You can always change the direction that you're going in, and try and course correct and try and figure out, is this the way I want to go? Or do I want to go a little bit left? Or do I want to go a little bit right? And as long as you're moving and you're thinking about where you want to move, and you're being conscious of that, and you're trying to make changes to bring your direction to what you think is your goal, I think that's all that life really is. You just have to keep moving. And even if you don't know where you're going, and, as you move, you'll start to figure out where it is that you want to go. So on that note, I think I'd like to open it up for questions. I wanted to leave, 15, 20 minutes for people to ask specific questions, or if there are areas that, you'd like to get more information on. I don't know if anybody's been typing questions, but let me turn it over to the moderators.
Thanks, Mira. I, for one, loved hearing about your journey and what had led to the development of Tomato Jos, but also really enjoyed hearing about how you questioned your purpose and found your passion. And I also love how your company is shifting the scale and empowering women. So I'll just scroll through some of the questions that have come in, and consolidate some of them. One of them has been, has climate change affected your business at all?
Sure, that's a great question.
That's from Yali.
Okay, well, Thank you for that question. The short answer is definitely yes. In Nigeria, there are three main seasons. There's the rainy season, which just started around now. And that usually lasts from mid-May to sort of mid-September. And that's the time when most farmers are growing. Most farmers are rainy season farmers only, because the amount of land you can farm is much larger because you're only depending on the rain. So people farm rice, they farm corn, they farm some vegetables. A lot of the farming happens in the rainy season. And then in the dry season, the next season that happens is what we call the cold season, which in Nigeria, it's not cold compared to New England, but starting around November, December, we get the harmattan, which is this Sahara desert wind that blows down from the desert, and it sort of coats everything in this thin red dust, and the temperature ends up dropping down at night to low 60s, high 50s, where we are in the country, and in the daytime it'll be mid 80s. And that's actually a really great time for tomato growing. Tomatoes love cool nights and warm days, and that can help to increase yield if you can get your planting time right to get that cold season when you have your tomatoes in the ground. And then we transition to the hot season. The hot season is loosely from February through March, mid-April, and it is in Celsius, 40 degrees, 43 degrees during the day, and it maybe drops to 35, 32 at night. So in Fahrenheit, that's 100 plus degrees, 105 degrees during the day, maybe like 90 degrees at night. So it's really, really hot, and that can be a really hard environment for plants to thrive and grow in. One of the things that climate change is doing is that it's changing the patterns of when these seasons start and end. So Nigerian farmers used to know when the rain starts, it's going to continue going. What we've seen recently is that you'll see rain showers for 2 or 3 weeks, and then you'll see a gap for 2 or 3 weeks, and then you'll see rain again, and then you'll see a much more intense storm. So the storms will have more rain and more wind, but they will be fewer and farther between, and that really can affect negatively growth patterns for our farmers. Similarly, on the tomato side, the rains are ending much later, and that's making it hard for us to know, well, does that mean that the cold season is shorter? Or does that mean that the hot season is going to come later too? What does that actually mean for how we plant? So we're trying to be flexible. One of the things that we invest in a lot is our irrigation systems, and that gives us, and it gives our model farmers more flexibility. Even if the rain stops for a week or two, we can irrigate. And in the dry season, irrigating can help the soil to be a little bit cooler. But certainly, there's a lot of concern. There's also a lot of desertification going on where, erosion is happening across the country. The Sahara Desert is sort of creeping lower and lower and lower towards Nigeria. And so we're trying to mitigate that with better irrigation systems, the use of manure, the use of organic matter. So there's a culture in Nigeria of slash and burn. At the end of the season, you just burn the corn stalks or the rice stalks to get rid of them. We're trying to help farmers invest in plowing that organic matter back into the soil to help make the soil a little bit more rich, and to help those kinds of things can help to increase resilience against climate change. But certainly it's a big issue.
Great. Along the same lines, Kathleen Mystery had asked, is there any water shortage that you've experienced out there?
So on the commercial farm, so when I first started, I wasn't on the land that I'm on today. I again asked for help, and I was very fortunate that a farmer in Nigeria who had a large farm that he wasn't fully utilizing told me I could farm on a corner of his land for free. In that land, we were confined to pumping water out of boreholes. And we didn't have enough water. A tomato field requires like 10,000 liters of water a day per hectare, which is a lot of water. And, we couldn't get that much water out of the ground. We moved to a location that's on the edge of a dam. And so we now have for the commercial farm, the nucleus farm and the model farms, we've got a pumping station, an irrigation system that we've set up that is able to provide water year round. But the outgrower farmers really struggle with irrigation. It's a big challenge. A lot of the outgrowers don't have access to the same plot of land every year. So it's hard for them to invest in fixed irrigation structures like a well or something, because they don't know if they're going to pump there. So what they do is they get these pumping machines, and then they have to buy that machine, and then they have to buy plastic pipes to pump from their water source all the way to wherever their land is. And that can be quite expensive. So we've actually been trying to see if we can bring in other organizations to help finance some of those needs to help them get better access to water. But yeah, it's tough.
A couple other questions along the lines of policy. What digital tech and changes in government policies do your farmers need? And that's from Burgess Godrej. And as well as, is there infrastructure and Wi-Fi in Nigeria? I felt those two questions kind of go hand in hand. Yeah.
So Wi-Fi is certainly increasing, but it's not across the board. So where we are, there's very poor network. We recently, we've bought like a network booster. Where I was initially, there was no internet at all. Even though it was only about 2 hours outside of the capital of the whole country, there was not even any phone network, let alone internet network. And I had to get satellite internet to be able to connect to anybody, which was really expensive. Where we are today, we've got a satellite booster. We're trying to work with one of the telecoms to increase coverage in the area where we are, but there are huge amounts of totally blackout areas, especially across the northern part of the country, where there just isn't good internet or any internet at all. You know, we're running on Edge. I don't know if anybody remembers Edge, because we're now on 5G in the US, but before 5G, there was 4G LTE. Before LTE, there was 3G, and before 3G, there was Edge. And a lot of Nigeria is still running on Edge, unfortunately, or just GSM. So, you know, that definitely limits some of the tech that we can do. The other thing that limits the tech, though, is that, you know, we're working with farmers who don't necessarily have smartphones, don't necessarily know, you know, what to do with a smartphone if they have one. In Nigeria, if you look at internet usage, more than 80 or 85% of the internet usage that's done is on Facebook. There's not a lot of use of the internet for like education and learning. There's not a lot of knowledge around, you know, what is possible through the internet. What we have seen is that, you know, there are tech solutions that a lot of people want to employ. We're using some of them for data capture. But at the end of the day, you know, what I always say is you can't use an app to learn the piano. You still have to go to the piano and practice the piano. And farming is very similar, where, you know, you can read about what you should do all day long, but until you're in your field, feeling the soil, doing that activity, that triggers a different kind of learning that is, you know, a more practical type of learning that has to accompany whatever digital learning you're taking in. So we're using a combination, but a lot of what we've seen has been really helpful, has been that practical component where somebody's in your field with you, showing you exactly what it is that they want you to do physically, and you're getting that physical muscle memory of how to do it.
So a couple of questions about the factory itself is, until the factory is up and running, what do you do with the increase in tomato production? Is there enough of local fresh market? And the same individual had commented, had asked, a significant problem for the US tomato canners is cost-effective shipping from field to cannery. As the range of your agricultural area grows, what transportation issues will you have to plan for? And that's from Dunn.
Yeah, those are great questions. So the first question is around the fresh, you know, where do we put all our tomatoes right now, right? And one of the reasons in my presentation, I said I plead the fifth on my operating margin, because when we work with our farmers, we're guaranteed to buy at a certain price. Now that price that we select with the farmers is based on what our cost needs to look like once we have the factory up and running. So for example, this year we agreed to buy from farmers at $100 a ton of tomatoes. We can sell the tomatoes once they're in paste format for a much higher price, but we're taking those tomatoes at $100 a ton from our farmers, and then we're selling them in the open market. And because of COVID-19 in particular, there was a huge disruption in the supply chain of tomatoes in Nigeria during the spring, which is when we were harvesting. Easter is usually, there are usually peaks in demand for tomato. So Christmas is a big peak. There are the 2 Eid ceremonies, which are big peaks. And then Easter is a big peak as well, in terms of when people are buying food, they're celebrating, they want to really, do something great with their families. You also see, weekends being smaller peaks in the cycles of demand, because most people are going shopping for the week during the weekend. And a lot of people will buy food, blend it, freeze it if they have a freezer, and then hold on to it for the week. So you see these mini demands. They're really important because tomatoes are so perishable. So we've tried to match our harvesting schedules with when we know, supply is demand is going to peak. So we'll harvest every Tuesday so that by Thursday our tomatoes can get to the markets in Lagos, and then by Friday they can be sold and people will go and eat them on Saturday, Sunday. With COVID, there was a lockdown in Lagos, there was a lockdown in Port Harcourt, there was a lockdown in Ibadan. Those are the big coastal cities that drive a lot of demand. And so we had huge amounts of tomatoes that were, we were trying desperately to get out of our farm. We were harvesting 3 truckloads each harvest. And, each truck is holding 30 tons of tomatoes. We ended up buying tomatoes from our farmers at $100 a ton and then selling them into the market at $70 a ton or $60 a ton at sometimes, because that was the price that the market was willing to take, because demand had been so depressed because the supply routes to the big cities were cut off because of COVID. And so we ended up making a negative operating margin because I couldn't go back to the farmers and say, you know what, never mind, I'm not paying you what I said I would. We want the farmers to trust us. We know that next year when we have a factory, we will be able to buy at that price and sustain it. So we sacrificed our own operating margin. We told our investors we were going to do this. And we ended up losing money on that, but gaining the trust in the farmers and gaining the ability to sort of keep them in our program. As we grow, definitely geography is really important. The roads in Nigeria are really bad. In California, you can have a factory that's 200 miles away from your tomato farm. In Nigeria, we're really localized in what we're doing. I don't want to be more than a 2-hour drive away from any farm that's supplying our factory. And so depending on how good the road is, that could mean we're 10 kilometers from a farm, or at the very highest end, maybe we're 50 to 60 kilometers away from that farm. But we have a much, much, much smaller radius of where we can draw from for our farm.
Were there any bureaucratic roadblocks you faced in getting all your permits from the relative agencies? That's from Varas Daver, my dad. And along the same lines, I was wondering if you ever received any pushback, being that you're not Nigerian, you're not local, and kind of how you dealt with that.
Sure. So, and I think somebody else had asked a policy question too. I apologize, I forgot to answer that. So Nigeria, I think, is very similar to India in a lot of ways. The legal, they were both British colonies. The legal codes are probably almost exactly the same. There's a huge amount of bureaucracy at the federal, state, and local level. It can be hard to figure out who's supposed to do what. And, a lot of the time civil servants end up being, not super committed to their jobs, or not super, concerned about whether or not the people they're serving are actually getting the services that they're supposed to provide. So I think, one thing that really helped me was the 4 years that I spent with the Clinton Health Access Initiative before I started Tomato Jos. I learned all these like small things that sound sort of silly, but they can actually make a big difference. So for example, anytime I drop off a letter at any government group, and you always have to do it in person. You can't just send an email. You have to go with a physical letter on your physical letterhead. And then you have to take a copy, and you come to the office and they stamp to say they've received it. And then you give them, your copy and say, stamp this too, because then you have a record that says, I know someone at your office got this letter. And you can come back in 2 weeks and say, hey, I sent you guys this letter. Here's my copy demonstrating that somebody here, signed for this letter and received it. Where has it gone? Has it gone anywhere? What's going on? And so I think that learning how to do those kinds of things was really valuable because, and just learning that you have to be persistent and that nobody else is going to care about this as much as you. So if it's going to get pushed through, you have to be the one to push it through at every level. I think that's one thing that I learned. Another thing that I learned was that it's easier to say no 100% of the time than 99% of the time. So Nigeria has a reputation for corruption and bribery and things like that. And I learned pretty quickly, they have a saying in Nigeria that's like, oh, you're speaking too much English, which means why are you trying to be foreign? I'm asking you for a bribe, and I speak too much English all the time. I play completely dumb if somebody asks me something and they're like, oh, I want to see you. And I'm like, okay, you're seeing me right now. I use my foreignness as I know exactly what people are asking me for, but I'm going to play dumb because I find it easier to sort of maintain my integrity 100% of the time. If I slip one time and say, okay, fine, I'm going to give you this thing one time, just put my paper on the top of the pile for that guy to sign. It's a very slippery slope. Clay Christensen, who's was a pretty well-known professor at Harvard Business School, had the same philosophy where it's it's easier to say no 100% of the time than 99% of the time, just because 99% can turn into 98%, can turn into 95%, can turn into 60% so quickly that you don't realize it. The second question, Ushta, you had another question too. About challenges I have faced as a foreigner.
Exactly. Yeah.
So I think I think that being white is helpful. There's an assumption that, Americans are going to be more honest. I don't know why that is or where that's come from, because I've certainly met a lot of dishonest Americans. But I know that if I were an unmarried Nigerian woman trying to do this same job and business, the focus on marriage is so important in Nigeria that I think I would have a lot harder time being taken seriously than I do. I think the fact that I'm foreign makes up for the fact that I'm a woman, if that makes sense. I'm so other and I'm so different that it's hard to categorize me. And I also, having now lived in Nigeria for basically 12 years, I have a pretty deep understanding of Nigerian politics, of Nigerian history, of Nigerian culture. And when I feel it's necessary to demonstrate how deep my understanding of the country runs, I can pull out those references, seemingly casually, and immediately, let people know that I know what I'm talking about. I know this country, and I'm here to stay. I'm not going anywhere.
Along the lines of kind of women in general, can you discuss banking, and can women in Nigeria have their own bank accounts and their own names? I guess, yeah, I'll leave it at that question and go to the next question. Yeah.
So where we are in Nigeria, I'm in a state called Kaduna State, which is in sort of the north central part of Nigeria. Technically, it's geopolitically the Northwest. Banking is very, very limited, especially to women. Maybe one of the women we work with has a formal bank account in her own name, but the vast majority of them do not. They don't even, many women don't even have, where we are, their own cell phone. They have to share it with their husband, or they share with their family. So certainly, we've been trying to figure out how to improve banking services and get our farmers to be able to, save in a bank. One of the big challenges is that there are no rural banks. So the closest actual bank to where we are is probably a 30-minute drive away from where our farm is located, maybe a 40-minute drive away. Banks in Nigeria have a really hard time operating because everybody always wants to make withdrawals. Nobody ever wants to make deposits. And so it's really hard for them to sort of maintain that balance and figure out how to operate and function. Even in the city, even in Kaduna City, you'll find oftentimes ATMs will just be out of money, and nobody's gone to restock them. So the systems are really, really poor and in bad condition, even in the urban areas. They're much, much worse in the rural areas. So we've been trying to figure out alternative systems for how to support savings programs for our farmers, and how to get them into the banking system.
Thanks. And then what is the total amount of farmers you currently employ, and what is the breakdown between women and men farmers?
So
also, to tie into that question, where do you, how do you find the farmers?
Yeah. So I think it's this slide, we talk about our partner farmers and our full-time staff and our employment reach. So I can sort of break those numbers down for you. The partner farmers, we say it's 352. In terms of the farmers that are actually primary farmers with their own contracts with us, it's about 75 farmers that have entered into a contract with us. And then the rest of the farmers in that are like within their group, they're sort of like, they're doing labor alongside those farmers. So of the 75 contract holders, the farmers that are actually primary holding contracts, I think it's about this year, it was 30 women and 45 men as primary farmers. Now the secondary farmers, it's a mix. It's probably because those are oftentimes it can be family members, but sometimes it's also paid labor. Depending on what activity the farmer is doing on that day, they may hire women or men in different proportions. So for example, if you're doing fertilizer application, usually you'll hire men to do that. You'll have men to do that. It's a little bit more physically intensive. But if you're harvesting, you might hire more women because it requires a little bit more skill because you only want to pick the red fruits. You don't want to stamp all over the field. So the split on the secondary farmers is probably about, I would say 60-40 also, 60% men, 40% women. Our full-time staff, those are Tomato Jos employees. Those are the guys, we have a sales team, we have warehousing, we have a maintenance team, we have the tractor drivers, we have the guys that run our commercial farm, our smallholder team. We have out of 50 employees, I think 15 women, so about 1/3, a little less than 1/3 women. And then the total employment reach, that number refers to all of the casual day laborers that we hire in any given time. If we're planting on the commercial farm or harvesting or doing construction work or doing whatever, we typically hire day laborers to help support that work. And that's probably, I'd say, 70% men and 30% women. So, we are actually making a pretty big impact. We have a very close relationship with the local chief in our area, and, crime rates have gone down since we've started working because a lot of the sort of unemployed young people have something to do. They know if they show up at our gates in the morning, they're probably going to get a job in something or the other.
That's really fascinating. Are you accepting any equity investors, as well as has your involvement been only from private sector or also USAID or World Bank?
Sure, we certainly would be happy to talk to equity investors. There's a couple. We're in the middle. We're still raising money. We raised recently $3.9 million, but $3 million of that dollars is going just to the Italian factory equipment. And then we have to still build the factory and buy the generators and have money to survive and pay for inputs and things like that. So we're still raising just under $500,000 right now. There's depending on the investment amount that people are interested in, they can invest directly in Tomato Jos, or they can invest through an SPV that one of our investors has set up. So if people are interested in that, I'm happy to connect them to, I'm happy to talk offline about that. I've been really bad at raising grant money. And part of the reason for that is that, one of the questions that somebody asked was about the geographic concentration, right? We have to source our tomatoes from a relatively small geographic area. USAID and a lot of like Rockefeller Foundation, a lot of these big money, big check writing donors want to see an intervention that will reach 10,000 farmers and cover the whole country and, be active in at least 12 states. And I'm like, we're social and we're an enterprise. And the enterprise part of what I'm doing means that we need to make it make sense for us. And I would rather work with 1,000 farmers, but get them each to farm 1 full hectare and earn $1,000 on that hectare than to work with 10,000 farmers on 0.1 hectares, and they're each earning $100. Like, to me, I feel more motivated by large scale impact, that is game changing for the person who's receiving the impact. Changing somebody's income from $1 a day to $10 a day, to me, is a more deep impact. And if I'm only able to make that impact on 1,000 people, so be it, because those 1,000 people will forever change the fabric of their community. Whereas USAID is usually more interested in like, oh, just say you intervened in 10,000 farmers' lives and we'll write you this check. And I'm like, well, again, with like my integrity, like I can't write that grant because I know I'm not going to do that thing. So we've sucked at getting grant money, but we're trying to work, we're trying to find, just the way that we found investors who've believed in our mission. I'm trying to work to find, grant makers who also believe in our mission, and who, will be willing to see things in our way and be willing to accept our definition of what impact is.
Yeah, I think that speaks a lot to what you were mentioning earlier about keeping your focus on what it is that you really want to accomplish. Definitely. So do you find yourself getting involved in any feminist issues such as child marriage or other social issues because of the women you're empowering economically? And that's from Spenta.
So I'm trying to figure out how to do that, because there's certainly, we've had issues. So let me give you an example. We harvested this year, we were harvesting, like I said, 90 tons, 100 tons a day. That requires, in one single day, 400 people to be on your fields picking tomatoes at the same time. So when we would have these crazy, huge bonanza days where like the whole village basically shows up, and I've got investors who care about child labor. So I'm trying to like be on the field being like, that person's too small, get her off the field. Like she can't work here. And they're like, but she's already a mother. And I'm like, oh my gosh, she looks like she's 15, maybe 12, I don't care if she's a mom, they're like, but she's a grown up, she's married. And I'm like, this is not good, so we're trying to figure out, I'm trying to figure out how to be empowering without disrupting the fabric of the community so much that we get major pushback. One of the challenges, one of the reasons I want to really bring more women farmers into the program is because the impact is much, much greater with women. So we're in a Muslim community. It's a polygamous community. There's actually a notice in the northern part of Nigeria, after the corn season, which is the main production season, after the rainy season, every October, November, you see most farmers selling their corn. That corresponds with a jump in mattress sales, because most farmers, many male farmers, will celebrate their harvest by marrying a new wife. And, whereas many women farmers will celebrate the harvest by like re-roofing their house, or, buying some, putting their kid in a private school. And so we're trying to figure out how to shift that balance, how to create more incentives, or maybe just how to pull other nonprofits now that we have entered into this community and we can sort of provide a backbone for other people that want to do other interventions, and we can help them navigate the, local tribe and talk to the leaders and do things like that. Like, again, with the focus, like I care so much about this stuff, but I'm also here at the behest of the local chief and at the behest of the state government. And I try to sort of balance out like, what can I actually bite off and chew versus, what can't I do? And so a little bit of it is trying to figure out, well, if we can just keep working with these women, if we can somehow structure additional educational programs for them that are separate, then maybe we can start to drip in things like family planning. And then we can try and like bring in some kind of another NGO that can do family planning work or that can do other work that we can't necessarily do, because I see a lot of these challenges. It's really hard to see it, and I want to make changes, but I also want to do it in a way that's respectful to the community.
Thanks. I think we only have time for a couple more questions that we have. So I'll kind of wrap up with some summary questions about, personally, can you comment on some of the sacrifices that you're making, such as family and socially, kind of in building this venture, as well as, right now with COVID, you're currently in Boston, your company's in Nigeria. How are things and what are the biggest challenges there?
Sure. I think that certainly being far away from, people that you love is hard. When I first started the company, I was not taking a salary. I had $80,000 of student loans that was like increasing. And then I, had credit card debt that was adding up because I didn't have a salary. And I, couldn't even make phone calls. I couldn't watch TV. I couldn't watch, I like sports. I couldn't watch any sports. There was all these things that I was missing out on. And, I felt, I lived in, initially when we were in the first location, I was living in this converted chicken coop in the middle of nowhere with like compressed cardboard walls and a tin roof. And, I only ran my generator for 3 hours a day because I didn't want to waste money. So I had no refrigeration, it was tough. And I lived like that for 2.5 years before, moving to now Kaduna City, which is a 4 million person city. And I have a real house and I have, real electricity and I have a fridge and stuff. And, I have a grocery store I can walk to, but, it was definitely hard. It was lonely. A lot of my Harvard Business School classmates were making like crazy amounts of money and were like, are you okay? Like, are you sure you still want to be doing this? And, it was a challenge, certainly there were times I asked myself, like, why am I still doing this? But at the same time, it's also like, I wanted to see it through to the bitter end. And I felt like every time we did make progress, I'm like, we are on the right track. We just need to keep pushing. And so I think, as we've gotten more funding, as we've gotten more success, I've tried to find ways to balance out my time in Nigeria versus my time, in the US with my family, trying to remember like what things I like to do outside of work and then actually create time to do them. Resilience is something I think that I have a lot of, but it still gets depleted. And so it's still important, again, to pay attention. Like I said, pay attention to where you are, pay attention to how you're doing. And if you need to, get somewhere where you can replenish that, then, it's important to do that. And it's important not just for you, but also for the company that, you're leading. So I've been recently taking, I would say probably taking 4 trips a year to the US to spend time with my parents and try and see other family and just try and, live in a place that's a little bit less stressful and a little bit easier to be in. I'm here now and my team is in Nigeria, but I think part of the reason that things are still going well is because I've really tried to focus on the last 6 months in team building. And I've made, a couple of key hires on the management team. And I've really tried to start trusting them and tried to start figuring out how to be a more effective manager so that I can empower them to be critical thinkers, make their own decisions, tell me what those decisions are. We're setting up frameworks like on the processing. Okay, if it costs less than this amount, if, XYZ conditions are met, you go ahead and make that decision. And then you just show me what thought you put into that decision so that I can feel comfortable that you made the right decision, or even if you made the wrong decision, that there was some basis for you to make it. And, we're also communicating. I'm having executive management meetings 3 times a week. I meet with my processing team twice a week. We have working meetings. I'm on calls all the time to try and stay connected. And I'm doing like a video chat or video call with my general staff once a week as well, posting it to our private YouTube channel. So we're trying. COVID is weird, but COVID is making everybody remote. And so I think that there's some lessons to be learned there more generally.
Thanks. And I see some people are dropping off, but Mira has been more than gracious in offering people to message her directly if you have any questions that haven't been answered today. And the lasting question I want to ask is, if you could go back in time to when you started all of this, what's the one piece of advice that you would have given kind of your past self from something that you've learned?
I think done is better than perfect. Even if it's not perfect, just get it done, get it sent. You can fix it later.
Some good advice. Well, thank you so much, Mira, for your time. It's truly inspiring story and amazing work that you've done that hopefully will inspire so many of us as we do our own work and kind of find our passions. We normally would be meeting in person. We'd be giving you a lovely WZCC pin and t-shirt to go home with, which we'll send over to your family's house locally. And we'd also love to make you an honorary WZCC member for the remainder of the 2019 year as well.
Thank you so much. Well, it's been a pleasure. And thank you everybody for tuning in.